By around 9 a.m., the fog was beginning to lift right the way across the wide battlefield, and Rawlinson was now able to employ his final weapon in his armory: aircraft. The Royal Air Force, barely a few months old, sent in 600 fighters and bombers to provide close air support to the Allied infantry. Phosphorus bombs were dropped ahead of the advancing tanks, and the planes strafed German ground targets like machine gun emplacements, which were much easier to spot from the air.
Low-flying planes ate away at German morale. For any experienced British airman, it was a bewildering experience.
We were over the target and dropping bombs before I realised we'd crossed the lines. I leaned over the side to watch them fall. If you ever look down from a high building and felt as though you must throw yourself down, I had to turn away.
Gaps were now appearing in the German line, which the Canadian and Australian troops tried to exploit as quickly as possible. This led to one of the more bizarre sights of the day. A group of Canadian cyclists pedalled off down the road, their rifles slung across their shoulders. They were escorting a group of armour-plated cars carrying machine guns. The Allies were willing to try anything to increase their speed and mobility. The cyclists sped off down the road, looking for German positions. This mobility paid off when they came across the enemy-held village of Mézières. The cyclists rode through the back streets and overwhelmed a German machine gun post from behind.
But in this area, north of the River Somme, the British ran into the most stubborn resistance of all. They were heading across here towards that high ground over there called Chipilly Ridge, when they ran into concentrated fire that stopped them in their tracks.
The British troops didn't have that many tanks supporting them because the terrain on this side of the Somme was unsuitable. To make matters worse, these men had borne the brunt of months of heavy fighting and they were weakened and exhausted. They did manage to get to the edge of this open field just opposite Chipilly Ridge over there. But as soon as they got here, they were driven back into these woods by devastating German machine gun fire.
The British north of the Somme were pinned down in front of Chipilly Ridge. But to the south of the river, Rawlinson's plan was ahead of schedule. By late morning, most of his men had reached the second objective, the Red Line. They'd moved a remarkable 5 miles in half a day. Already, some of the light Whippet tanks had pressed on at a heady 8 miles an hour, causing havoc behind enemy lines.
The exploits of one of these tanks, nicknamed Musical Box, would pass into legend. For 9 hours it ran wild, attacking German artillery from the rear, surprising resting German troops, and even ramming a truck into a stream. The Germans peppered the tank with bullets. They perforated fuel tanks stored on the roof, and soon petrol was flooding down inside the tank. The crew were forced to don gas masks as they pushed on, now ankle-deep in petrol. Soon, a German shell hit the tank and it burst into flames. The 3 crewmen scrambled to escape, and as they did so, one of them was shot dead and the other 2 captured by the Germans.
The British tank drivers weren't the only ones to feel the heat of the German guns that afternoon. On the southern banks of the River Somme, Australian troops were taking a beating from German artillery firing at them from across the river, from positions high up on Chipilly Ridge, which the British were still struggling to capture.
Hours after the British were supposed to have captured this vital sector of the north bank of the Somme, the area was still in German hands. Every time British troops tried to leave the shelter of this wood, they were cut down by German machine gun and artillery fire. The prospects for advancing any further looked grim, and it wasn't until the next day that Allied troops finally managed to secure the north bank of the Somme.
But on this first day of battle, August the 8th, Rawlinson's units south of the River Somme were pushing deeper and faster into German-held territory than ever before. To keep up the pace of his advance, Rawlinson ordered his horsemen to go into the front line. 2 entire cavalry divisions, over 20,000 horsemen, now moved up to the front through the infantry to begin the attack on the final objective, the Blue Line.
The cavalry surged forward, easily outstripping the lumbering tanks that were supposed to provide them with supporting fire. But once the horsemen left the tanks behind, they found themselves at the mercy of German machine guns. One group of horsemen left this village of Beaucourt and ran into lethal fire from that wood over there. Men and horses crashed to the ground, the surviving horses stampeded. Even with this bloodshed, August the 8th would still be the British cavalry's most successful day of fighting on the Western Front during the entire war. The German line had been shattered, and for the first time in years, the cavalry could charge through the gaps. They galloped east, sowing chaos behind enemy lines and taking thousands of prisoners. By noon, it was clear that enemy resistance was confined to a few small pockets. Everywhere else, their positions were collapsing. Allied soldiers found that the German troops were all too willing to surrender to them. In fact, one lone Australian was nearly overwhelmed when 100 Germans tried to give themselves up. The once mighty German army was showing signs of falling apart.
The Germans were surrendering everywhere. You could feel the hair pricking up on your spine with excitement because we knew it was going to be the end of the war.
Ludendorff lost more ground to the Allies on the first day of the Battle of Amiens than on almost any other day in the war on the Western Front. But what he found even harder to accept was that entire German units had surrendered wholesale, and the skill with which the British had coordinated tanks, aircraft and artillery was beyond anything the Germans were now capable of.